Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ask the Expert session on Visual Studio, GitHub, and Azure. I'm Leslie Richardson. I'm a program manager on the Visual Studio team, and I will be your moderator for this evening. And today I am joined by a panel of awesome experts and colleagues who are all very knowledgeable about each of these three products. And we're going to be answering your questions about how Visual Studio, GitHub, and Azure all come together to form the new developer cloud, which allows you to be more productive and collaborative across your teams, no matter where you're at or what machine you're using. So a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. How the session is going to work is this is a 30-minute session where you can use the chat and Teams to ask whatever related questions that you want. Once your question gets approved, I can ask the expert about them, and they will respond either via the chat or verbally. And if you see that somebody else has written a fabulous question and you want to make sure it gets asked, please make sure to upvote it. And last but not least, we will conclude the session by bringing out some additional resources for you in case you want to learn more. Couple etiquette things. This session will be recorded. So please be considerate and respectful and do not spam or post any inappropriate comments in the chat, and make sure that you are adhering to the Microsoft Code of Conduct, which is listed in the chat, and I will leave up for a couple seconds for you to read. All right. Without further ado, it's time to meet the experts. So let's have everyone go around and introduce themselves, starting with Paul.
Hey everyone, I'm Paul Yuktovich. I'm one of the lead PMs working on Azure Dev Experience, things like tools in Visual Studio Code, and some dev services in the portal.
Right, Kendra?
Hi, I'm Kendra Havens. I'm a program manager on Visual Studio and .NET, and I work mostly on the testing tools and productivity, so .NET tooling.
Good. Anson?
Hey, I'm Anson Horton. I'm the platform architect for Visual Studio, so I work on evolving kind of the Visual Studio platform, extensibility of the Visual Studio shell, and things related to that.
Awesome. Andy?
Yeah, Andy Stellans. I'm the lead PM for diagnostics in Visual Studio, so things like debugging, profiling, IntelliTrace, that sort of thing. So ask any questions on that.
Great. Ryan?
Hey everybody, my name is Ryan J. Salva. I've spent the last 20 years working on developer tools and services. The last 10 of those at Microsoft, where I was working with Microsoft's internal engineering systems called 1ES. This last year, I brought the Azure DevOps and App Center team with me over to GitHub, and now I am building out the GitHub internal engineering platform while still kind of working on Azure DevOps and App Center.
Sweet. Matthew?
Hey, I'm Matthew Isabel. I'm a product manager at GitHub, and I work on code spaces.
Great. And last but not least, Shane.
Hey, I'm Shane Boyer. I'm a cloud advocate on the Azure team. All things Azure, I specifically lead the .NET and mobile efforts on the advocate team, as well as Power Apps too.
All right. So we can give some people time to start coming up with their questions and submitting them. I want to kickstart this by asking, what exactly is the developer cloud and why does it exist? How did it come to be? So Anson, I'm going to pass that off to you first.
Awesome. So the developer cloud is, essentially a thing that's been developing over the course of a number of years, right? And it's a kind of a layered approach to development with the kind of collaboration that we have now with both Visual Studio and GitHub and Azure, right? It's sort of reimagining what the developer workflow looks like with kind of the introduction of DevOps and services that help both kind of the outer loop and the inner loop moving forward. And one of the things that we did with Visual Studio most recently is look at services as they relate to that inner loop, and code spaces is certainly one of those things that I think we'll talk about in this chat.
All right. So we actually have one question in the chat already. So GitHub Enterprise, it seems like, oh, or no, we don't. Okay, so to follow up for now on the accessible anywhere section of the developer cloud, what does that apply to, or what are the, so is this compatible with VS Code, Visual Studio, and what kinds of projects can people use in a code space, for instance? And I will direct that to Kendra.
So what kind of products can people use in a code space? So right now, for .NET users specifically, we recommend .NET Core projects and some things that might usually work with .NET Core, like you might have a WinForms or a project that targets .NET Core. It's available, but we might not have brought over all of the designers, so you might still need to edit source code manually. So some of the more UI features we might not have yet. Especially for this preview for code spaces, we recommend sort of server-side apps or web apps, because those components that you'll be using, the app casting that you can get normally F5ing your app just like you would if you were running it locally. It's streaming down from the server, and that's a really smooth process right now. Yeah.
Great. So one question we have is, will we have an offline tool to validate our YAML files? So on Azure pipelines and or GitHub Actions, many times you need to create a commit to validate this YAML code. So Ryan, do you want to start with that?
Sure, yeah. I'll have to say, I don't know of any offline tool under development today to validate YAML specifically for pipelines or for actions. However, that does sound like a magnificent VS Code extension, and I would invite anyone on the call to build one.
Hey Ryan, did you know there's actually a really cool one from the community that's pretty good?
Oh really? Tell me about it.
Check it out.
Sweet. There's an extension for everything these days.
Paul, do you know what to search for?
I'll speak up in a moment. I'll tell you.
Okay, yeah, find it there. Sweet.
Great. So will GitHub code spaces be provided as a private instance for enterprise companies within GitHub Enterprise? So Matthew, do you want to take that?
Sure. So will code spaces be provided as a private instance for enterprise companies within GitHub Enterprise? I think if this is a question on kind of the availability of it on premises, that's still something we're working through. So I'd love to hear kind of a follow-up on kind of interest there if you want to put that in chat, because I'd love to know more about what you're hoping to do with it, why you would want to use it on premises, things like that. Right now, we're really focused on the cloud offering and the cloud beta that we have at the moment. But as we kind of keep advancing through the beta period here, I think we'll definitely be sharing more on kind of what we're looking at for the enterprise in the future.
All right. So what exactly is new in some of these spaces, like Visual Studio? Andy, do you want to tell us more about what's cool in Visual Studio these days?
Yeah, sure. With 16.8, we had a lot of features for C#9, some rods and analyzers that I'm sure Kendra would love to talk to. Added some extra Git experiences, so integration with Git for managing merges and things like that. On the debugging space, we added support for Linux core dumps without the need to use like a container or another OS to look at that. So if you ever run .NET apps up on a Linux container, you can now analyze those dumps and inspect memory in Visual Studio. For XAML experiences, made some improvements to the data binding. So if you've ever used XAML and had challenges with data binding, like missing properties and stuff like that, there's a whole tool window that was updated with some warnings in that. Those are the top things that come to my mind, at least. It was just out in the 16.8 preview 3.1.
Awesome. Anyone else have any other?
Kendra should talk to some of those rods and analyzers for C#9.
Oh, yeah, I'm super excited about additional analyzers. Generally, there's a bunch of new analyzers in .NET 5 as well, and these are actually about finding latent bugs in your code. So we've actually introduced a whole new group that can basically identify when you are misusing things and just common patterns and best practices, it will actually suggest to you. There's actually so many that we also introduced analysis levels. So you don't have to get them all at once. You can actually choose a lower analysis level and go back to the lower amount of analyzers that you might have been getting. So there's a bunch of just quality improvements that you can get with your code. Yeah, besides that, a bunch of performance improvements that I think Andy mentioned. There's some in Debugger, there's some in Test Explorer, there's definitely some in the .NET platform. So yeah, lots of exciting stuff.
Awesome.
I would love to throw in too, there's a new, and Andy may have mentioned it very quickly, but there is a new kind of Git experience that has lit up inside Visual Studio. It's kind of a reimagining of how to interact with Git as opposed to using kind of Team Explorer, which targeted originally more for on-premise scenarios. So it's definitely worth checking out if you have not.
I personally love that new integrated experience. I just find it easier. Great. So will GitHub Enterprise replace Microsoft DevOps over time, or what's the transition for that going to be like? I'm going to pass that to Ryan.
Sure, yeah. So I kind of introed myself by saying that prior to come over to GitHub, I ran Microsoft's internal engineering systems, 1ES. And one thing that everyone should know is that Microsoft is powered on Azure DevOps today. We have over 80, 90,000 developers producing something like 110,000 builds a day. It's a crazy amount of volume on Azure DevOps. And so Microsoft's business itself depends upon Azure DevOps success. Having said that, we are definitely on a journey to kind of aggregate the vast majority of our new investment in the developer cloud, in DevOps tooling on GitHub. In fact, I see for Microsoft engineering itself, over the course of the next 5 or so years, we will be on a journey to move many of our engineering systems onto GitHub for repositories, to actions for CI/CD, to advanced security, to do things like lock down and improve the security of the software that we ship. And so we expect that many customers are going to want to travel that same path with us, because the vast majority of our kind of new investment is a collaboration between things like Visual Studio and GitHub and Azure and GitHub. So we're going to continue to take Azure DevOps forward, but it's going to be at a slower pace. And it's going to be because we're spending so much more of those resources and that investment on the GitHub side of things. Why? Because that is where, frankly, that is where the development community is. There are over 50 million developers working inside of GitHub every year, every month. And that type of, frankly, cloud neutral or cloud agnostic space provides a neutral territory for developers, no matter what their affiliation, no matter what their favorite language is, to collaborate and to work together. So yes, we do see GitHub being the future. And yes, we're committed to making sure that Azure DevOps carries forward, both for our business and for yours.
Great answer. So apparently there's not a lot about Blazor at Ignite right now. So can somebody talk to how well this is being adopted and for the future of Blazor, specifically in Visual Studio, and how, if Microsoft is using this internally for our projects? So how about Anson, do you want to take that?
I can. I honestly don't know too much. I can tell you that there are a few teams inside Microsoft that are using Blazor. And that Blazor is continued to be developed technology, and there is a good amount of work going on the .NET team. And I think Kendra may have some additional stuff, so I'm going to hand it over to Kendra.
I totally do. So one of the main ways we're dog fooding Blazor internally, and sorry, dog food is our word that we use when you eat your own dog food, you have to taste it before you ship it. Anyway, we're using Blazor internally, and a really big one is on try.net. So a lot of our docs have embedded C# in the browser that you can just click run and actually run the code snippet that the doc is explaining. So a lot of our Learn documentation on oh, what's the URL? I think it's like learn.net or learnvisualstudio.com or something like that. I can put it in chat in a bit, but that's definitely using Blazor on tons and tons of our documentation. So just basic, like when you're first learning strings and everything, you actually don't need to download anything in IDE or even .NET. You can just start trying out our language features right there. So that's something that we're always looking to like make sure performance is really good on and make sure it's a really good experience. Yeah, as far as Blazor integrating with things like code spaces, we're still bringing a lot of our Razor tooling online, but we're definitely, yeah, it's definitely underway.
That is exciting. You're really selling it too. So
I get excited.
Awesome. Yeah, it's like you didn't seem excited at all during that.
Yeah, so, one other thing too I'll mention is just recently today we also announced that we added support in Azure for Blazor and Azure Static Web Apps too. So we're adding support everywhere for Blazor, and it's just it's a fairly new product. So as we have internal and external customers ask for the support, we're just continuing to kind of iterate on the support for it, and you'll see more and more about what we're doing for Blazor. So it's a very important product to us.
Great. So now that we're having Visual Studio join the CodeSpace family, will we begin to see more parity between Visual Studio and Visual Studio Code? And I'm going to direct that to, who wants to take it? Andy, do you want to take that?
I think Anson might be the best one for this one.
Okay, bounce it to Anson.
Yeah, I can take this one. So that's a great question. And I think the answer is that it's going to depend a lot on what you folks ultimately want, right? A big part of this is that it gives us the capacity and the capability, like architecturally, to do that. So one of the things you may have noticed if you have used live share, for example, like one of the things that is possible is that I'm just gonna move my cat, is that in live share you can see kind of a solution-like view when you're connected from VS Code into Visual Studio, and that's because in that world the Visual Studio is doing kind of the processing for the solution, and that's where the kind of the compute is happening. In the same way in code spaces, the compute is happening on this remote host, this compute node, or potentially many compute nodes, and in that world, we can do a lot more in terms of lighting up the potentially very thin client with that functionality. Now, with the very specific question of are we going to do that, I think you'll see some changes in that direction. But in terms of how far we go, I think that'll largely depend on what people kind of ask for.
Great. So are there any more plans on adding additional enterprise features such as in GitHub and Azure Devops, like road mapping, rolling up projects into initiatives, and support for SAFE or SAFE? Shane, do you want to take this question?
I don't think I have the answer to that one. For DevOps and GitHub, I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that question. I think we've got some other experts in that area here.
Shane, I can step in there a little bit.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's take it on two different paths, one for Azure DevOps, one for GitHub. On Azure DevOps side of things, we recently worked with a couple of extensions that were already out there in the community to essentially take those under the umbrella of the Azure DevOps team. And we're building out a new extension that will actually build into the product itself, because we're taking two extensions, building them into the product. It'll be called essentially Azure DevOps Delivery Plans 2.0, and it will help with some of the kind of portfolio management and safe planning that we know a lot of enterprises do today. So that's on the Azure DevOps side of things. I was just reviewing our OKRs with the team today. It's on the backlog for this next quarter, with delivery probably coming in, let's call it like spring of next year. It's going to take a little while to bake. On the GitHub side of things, we also have a planning product that is in development today that will build on top of issues. You can kind of think of it as like, what if issues were to like have a baby with Airtable? That's probably the right way. And boards, like take Airtable, Azure DevOps boards, and GitHub issues, and you're going to get something kind of like that. It's codename Memex. We're really excited about it. It's going to really unfold over the course of the next year, but it's not going to be like, you know, we unveil it and it's fully baked. No, we're going to be very iterative about this and progressively open up new features and new capabilities every quarter over the course of the next year.
Exciting. So we've talked a bit about code spaces and the Git integration features in Visual Studio now, but what about the Azure side? So Paul, do you want to speak a little bit about what's new with Azure and how it can be incorporated in the developer cloud as a whole?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's so many good things to talk about. I mean, our managed services are getting better all the time. So thinking about like stateless web apps and APIs with app service, all the improvements there. If VMs are more your thing, there's a lot of options there, and also in networking and things like having more secure networks for your VNets and private nets. AKS or Azure Kubernetes Service, you might have caught the bridge to Kubernetes, which I'm excited about because it makes working on a particular service or microservice amongst a cluster or a fleet of services much easier. And then the dev experience is getting a lot better to follow more of think of a cloud native approach, which means using things like microservices, containers, using PaaS services, using caching, having better observability. So those are just some of many, many, many that get better. Then from the dev cloud side, you know, maybe Anson or Andy want to talk even more about that.
Cool. Yeah. No,
I mean, feel free, Andy, if you want to.
Oh, sorry, no, I was going to let you go. Developer cloud is definitely, I think, more your space.
Yeah, I mean, in general, we have kind of a number of, you know, kind of developer, like, I don't know, just inner loop things that we're doing to make it better for really everyone, I guess, like that is interested in, you know, were you specifically handing it off with respect to kind of like Kubernetes development? Was that around that, Paul, or something else?
Yeah, I guess so I was thinking about, we have a lot of experiences in Azure that make building a cloud app better. And then when I think about what you're working on, it's kind of using the cloud to build cloud apps. It's the awesome vicious circle. I should trademark that. So, you know, is there just anything there about like working with the cloud app in the cloud and having everything kind of co-located in the cloud? You see that adding some advantages there?
I see. Yes, absolutely. So generally, one of the things that as we are looking at services that kind of attempt to improve, you know, the inner loop, for example, or really just the development experience as a whole, one of the value adds of kind of like being in this world is like one of the challenges that you have with any of these kinds of services that you want to use potentially multiple compute nodes to process, right? Requires moving bits around, right? In many cases, particularly when you're talking about analyzing, you know, a workspace like the user's source code. So like if you have your source code and you wanted to like do a distributed build, for example, well,
yeah, build,
you know, yeah, one of the challenges is like, well, if you're on a you know, a thin pipe, right, then you move the bits to another node, that might take just as long as doing the computation to build in the local environment, right? And so then you have to make those trade-offs. But when you're in the same data center in Azure, you could be in the same rack, right? Like we really can get some massive throughput in those cases, and that allows us some new opportunities that we wouldn't have otherwise.
Great. Awesome responses across the board. So as we made a transition recently from calling it Visual Studio Codespaces to now GitHub Codespaces. So based off of this transition and the larger focus on GitHub, are we recommending that people use GitHub over Azure DevOps, since that's where the focus seems to be now? And who wants to speak to that? Let's see, Matthew?
I I think there's a lot of exciting things in GitHub that we've been announcing recently. So there's just a lot of excitement there. I also work at GitHub, so my perspective is definitely looking through that lens a bit. And I think there's just a lot of exciting things on the platform with code spaces and actions and so much more excitement around security, the advanced security beta and things like that. But I think there's still a lot of great reasons to use Azure Devops, and maybe Ryan can speak to that a little bit. But yeah, I think there's just a lot of excitement around kind of what's been new and what's been shipping lately in GitHub, and that's been great for us and great for the community. And yeah.
I think you nailed it, Matt. Here's the deal. Like, it's really going to depend upon the type of project you're building and what it is that you need. There's a lot in Azure DevOps today that's just not present in GitHub. Planning tools like boards just don't exist inside of GitHub today. There's no such thing as test plans inside of GitHub today. Frankly, the CD story, the deployment story with actions, it's coming up fast, but like right now, it's not quite at what I would call equivalency with GitHub. So like, you're going to really have to think about kind of what the lifetime of your project looks like, what your immediate needs are going to be, and what your needs might be in about 6 months, and make a somewhat more nuanced decision. We are at a transition time, and it does mean that there's not a very like crystal clear, black and white, simple answer. For me personally, I would use GitHub as my first choice, and then say, is there a thing that's going to make me use Azure DevOps rather than GitHub? Along the way, it also does not have to be an either or type of answer. We have many customers, very large and small organizations, who are choosing to use both together. So for example, hosting their code inside of GitHub so that they can take advantage of things like code spaces and advanced security and GitHub Insights, but they are still choosing to use Azure DevOps for their pipelines and their planning with boards. So essentially adopting a hybrid model while we build up some of the capabilities inside of GitHub. So it's a nuanced answer today. I know that doesn't make things easy, but it also means that there's so much potential and so many new things that are going to be lighting up over the course of the next several months. And so it's a good reason to go out there and experiment and learn something new.
Awesome. So we are running short on time, 2 minutes left to be exact. So as one final question, I want to direct it at Andy, since you've been working on the Visual Studio setup and customization experience. How has that setup changed since the adoption of code spaces, and what can we expect to see with that customization experience in the future?
Yeah, so I think in general, the problem we're trying to tackle is that as a developer, when you're on board to repo for the first time, you go through this painful experience of getting the tools, getting the environment set up, and we want to really simplify that. And what you can see with GitHub Code Spaces today is what we have with Visual Studio can literally install in minutes. So we obviously want to reduce the time it takes to get things up on your local machine, but also to provision that environment in the cloud and provide those customizations. So if your app needs SQL Server or something like that locally, because that's how you built your app, then you can use that tool. And so with customizations, we have a tool called DevInit that we're working on, and that we'd love to provide feedback from developers of what sort of capabilities it needs to enable you to get that remote environment, that environment in the cloud, to the point where it can run and debug your application.
All right. Well, that wraps up all the time we have for questions. So to close out, we have a couple actionable items. Let me get back to the PowerPoint. So if you haven't already, first things first, go and sign up for the GitHub Code Spaces beta. There's some cool new things to experience with that. If you want to try out the new features that we've talked about in Visual Studio, make sure to download the latest version of Visual Studio Preview. And last but not least, if you want to learn about all the new GitHub and Azure integration experiences, be sure to check out that link. And with that, this concludes our Q&A session. Thank you so much to everyone who attended, everyone who asked those great questions. Shout outs to the experts and the moderators for answering those questions with great panache. And until next time, happy coding and enjoy the rest of Ignite.